Hello, I'm Lorraine, and I'm a Heritage Pioneer volunteer at Grand Junction at St Mary Magdalene. Thank you for joining me for part 2 of my talk on early schools and education in North Paddington. Part 1, I talked about the foundation of the first school of St Mary Magdalene in 1865, and I'm going to continue from there with stories of schools and happenings up to the year 1926. You should be able to see an old map of the parish of St Mary Magdalene from 1923 on your screen, which I hope is useful for you in visualising the old streets around the church. You may also just be able to see the names of some of the streets. Many of these streets do not exist today. Take your time to familiarise yourself with the streets. The artist is Martin Travers, who was a church architect. After many years of attempts for education reform, a national elementary education was implemented for the children of working men, as it said on the bill. Known as the 1870 Elementary Education Act, it aimed to provide education for all children aged 5 to 13 years. The Act was groundbreaking. It was the start of the state taking responsibility for the education of its children. However, it didn't make schooling compulsory or free. It was the Education Act 1880 which made school attendance compulsory. All children from the ages of 5 to 10 years. This was raised to 11 years in 1893 and in 1899 to 12 years. It was not until the 1891 Education Act that education was free. That must have been a great relief in many households. At this pivotal time in education, the parish just established and the Reverend West busy with several projects, he asked for help from his friend in Wantage, the Reverend William John Butler. There, several sisters from the community of St Mary the Virgin at St Mary's Convent came and gave assistance in the parish. The sisters arrived in 1871, and they remained an integral part of the parochial work of St Mary Magdalene until 1944. They lived in a house on Delamere Terrace called St Anne's House. Their work was varied: house visits, teaching Sunday school, running temperance clubs, giving Bible study classes, even starting a coffee stall for cabmen in the hope to discourage drinking alcohol, supervising the St Mary Magdalene home on Ranley Road, which was a mother and baby's home. The sisters would accompany the women to Queen Charlotte Hospital for the birth. They also opened a house in Westbury Road to run a day school for daughters of gentlemen. This would eventually become St Mary's College for older girls, which later also added a teacher training department. By 1871, there were 700 children on the school books. The church bought a site on Cirencester Street around 1879 to build a chapel and schoolrooms. Local history tells us that this was the same site on which Desborough House stood and the residence of Mrs. Sarah Siddons from 1805 to 1817. A friend of Reverend West donated the money to enable him to buy the plot and build rooms for the boys' school and a chapel known as St Martha's, probably completed around 1881. A new girls' school was built and opened in 1895 in Ranley Road, in memory of Reverend West, who had died in 1893. The school was sometimes known as the West Memorial School. This tall building was next door to St Mary Magdalene Home and close to the premises of St Anne's House. One school report gives the names of what were probably the teachers in charge of the various schools. We must also remember that if a female teacher married, she was no longer allowed to teach. In 1898, the mistress of the girls' school was Miss E. Little, and the mistress of the infant school in Cirencester Street was Miss Mary Black, while the boys' school, now back in Clarendon Street, had the master, Mr. Robert Pratt. Wonderful names, just like characters from nursery rhymes. Miss Little went on to serve almost 40 years in the school. It is recorded quite precisely as 39 1/4 years in the school logbook. She served from January 1882 to March 1921. At that time, she's recorded as head of the girls' school in Ranelagh Road. In 1903, there were 3 St Mary Magdalene church schools. The school in Cirencester Street for 445 pupils, in Clarendon Street for 382 pupils, and in Ranelagh Road for 286 pupils. This is a total of 1,113 children. The school on Rowington Close had not yet been built. The 1870 Education Act promised education for all, so there needed to be schools for all. Those given the responsibility to ensure enough schools were available were the school boards. If it was necessary, they built schools. The schools were called board schools. Paddington came under direction of the London School Board, the LSB. It gained a good reputation and of being innovative during its working life until 1902, when replaced by the London County Council, LCC. The following are some of the board schools established at this time in the local area, with their original names and any later names. So there was Campbell Street, later Paddington Green Primary School, Essendine School, which was both a secondary and primary school for a while, D Street Board School, became Droop Street, and then later Queen's Park Primary, and I do believe that the old boys from this school were among the original founders of Queen's Park Rangers Football Club. The LSB felt it important to have a school in each corner of the newly built Queen's Park estate around 1870. St John's National School was already there, so a further 3 were built: D Street, Kilburn Lane, where now stands a new sports and leisure centre, and Beethoven Street. A special word about Beethoven Street: it was probably the first school in the country to teach woodwork. The government refused to give them a grant. It drew international attention. Finally, the government agreed and enabled all schools to receive grants for manual training, called D&T today. And this area of the curriculum really took off. The LSB reported while 4,000 boys received instruction in 1893, just 10 years later, it rose to 55,000. In addition, the government gave help for more national schools to be built, such as St Saviour's, St Augustine's, St Luke's, and St Michael's, Star Street. St Michael's had a department for canal boat children. Star Street houses had been built for the workers of the Grand Junction Canal, and the school had always made provision for children of canal workers. Now, around this local area, there were national schools and board schools side by side. Edward Wilson School would open later in 1915, at first as Senior Street Council School. The 1902 Education Act established a system of secondary education system long awaited, bringing together what was known as high-grade schools, like Beethoven Street was, and fee-paying secondary schools. Previously, working-class children had found access to secondary education difficult. The Act also abolished the school boards and replaced them with local education authorities, the LEAs. There were several more education acts from then until 1921 that covered secondary school scholarships, special needs, prohibiting or restricting employment of children working, welfare and school medical inspections, and school canteens. Small steps, but moving in the right direction. In 1914, a brand new infant school was built on Woodchester Street, now Rowington Close, which is where the present primary school stands today. 6 houses adjoining the church on Woodchester Street were demolished for the new infant school. At one time, the school roof was used as a playground. An entry in the school logbook for the 21st of July 1914 notes that the afternoon timetable would not be followed, as all classes would be up on the roof rehearsing songs for the grand opening of the new infant school the next day. The First World War had had a devastating impact on the country including the tragic loss and maiming of so many young men. Half of London's male teachers, 6,000, had left the profession to fight for their country. Life in the city must have been very frightening during the war. The school logbook reports children being kept away from school. October 1st, 1917. Attendance very poor, owing to the children being upset by the London air raids of the last 3 nights, Friday, Saturday and Sunday. Several parents sent notes and messages to say that they'd sent their children to the country on this account. Outside the church is a First World War memorial Calvary. This was designed in 1929 by Martin Travers, the same artist who did the map on your screen. He was a church architect who had worked for a while with Sir Ninian Comper, the designer of the wonderful St Sepulchre Chapel inside St Mary Magdalene Church. Travers was working on the church's Lady Chapel at the time when he created this map. I want to finish the talk with a report. It is the LCC HMI report of St Mary Magdalene's Boys' School in Clarendon Street in October 1926. Their words sum up the difficult circumstances that the children were living in and the provision of care that the school offered that went beyond simply giving them an education. The Clarendon Street area is one of the most depressing in the whole of London. In Clarendon Street itself, there are 118 houses, 16 of which are fitted and used as shops, and it is estimated that they house a population of well over 2,000 people. Most of the boys come from very poor, overcrowded homes. Indeed, of the 159 families represented in the school, 55 live in basements, while only 13 occupy more than 2 rooms. The report goes on to recount the work the school does in the social effort in the Clarendon area. There is a successful penny bank. Children are supplied with clothing, jumpers and boots, spectacles, and hot free meals, and opportunities for school journeys and short holidays by the sea or the country. To sum up, the school is in good condition, the social work is excellent, the boys are well behaved, and the members of staff work very hard and devotedly. This is a good place to end this short history of schools in North Paddington, and in particular about the early years of St Mary Magdalene Primary School. I hope you have enjoyed the talk. Thank you for listening.